We will now take our next panelist. We'll bring in our next keynote speaker in the person of Dr. Ali Zafar. Just quickly doing a lot of things. Okay, Dr. Ali Zafar is here with us. 1 second, I'll bring an introduction to him before we go further. So Dr. Ali is a global macroeconomist and private sector specialist. One second. Right, so he's been a consultant to the African Development Bank. He's currently, I believe, a consultant to the African Development Bank, formerly a senior economist at the International Financial Corporation, which is an arm of the World Bank, and formerly consultant to the United Nations, the Gates Foundation, and USAID. Ali is the author of a groundbreaking book, the CFA Franc Zone, Economic Developments and Post-COVID Recovery, published in 2021. The book is currently on Amazon, and one that everyone who is interested in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa development must read, written for the average reader on the street, not technical. And one that many of you academics here will need to recommend to your library for the study of Africa, because he's rewriting, quote unquote, the political economy of development in Sub-Saharan Africa, and especially in Francophone Africa, where he has traveled extensively. He knows all the countries that he's talking about. So on that note, make welcome, Dr. Ali Zafar. It's over to you, sir.
Julius, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I don't know much about the politics of Amazonia, but I wish you all peace and justice. I will focus my intervention on the macroeconomics and the CFA Franc Zone.
And Ali, before you continue, maybe I interrupt you again and make the disclaimer that all the views expressed at this conference by our panelists and guest speakers are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of the organizations that they work with currently or previously. And participation at this conference is not an endorsement of Amazonian independence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So the Franc Zone is an anomaly of history. It was created in the 1940s as a kind of way for France to cement the post-colonial relationship, post-independence relationship with both Central and West Africa. And when I arrived in the Franc Zone 2 decades ago, I was quite surprised by this arrangement as an independent macroeconomist. If we read the work of Catherine Schenck, many of the other zones in history have disappeared. The Sterling Zone was active in the 40s and 50s, and there was a push for independence in the 60s by Nigeria, by Ghana, by India, and there was not a desire by Britain to keep the zone. Of all the arrangement, the Franc Zone persisted for so long. So that has always been a puzzle to me. And so I wrote a book to try to understand the persistence of the Franc Zone. So my first kind of conclusion on the Franc Zone is that it's a political economy of elites. There are 3 elites in this system. One is the France and the French Treasury, who have kind of de facto set the rules of the zone. The 50% of the reserves have been in an operations account managed by the French Treasury. It is France which decides the devaluation in '94. And so there's a French kind of political and economic interest. The second is African political elites, Francophone. For a variety of reasons, they have decided to go with this system, which is in a kind of an outdated system. And for some kind of what they perceive as stability and what they perceive as a kind of a strong anchor. But and the third is the IMF, who is the de facto supporter of the system by supporting the kind of the monetary regime and the balance of payment problem. I won't go into the technical macro aspects, but so there's three separate elites involved. Now, what is not working in the Franc zone? Why did I decide to write the book? I spent a lot of time working in Asia and Middle East, and when I look at the developmental record of the Franc zone, it's falling behind most regions in the world. What has gone wrong in the Franc zone? The only thing that has gone right is that the inflation is lower than many parts of the world. But that has come at a very severe cost. One is the GDP growth per capita is much lower than anywhere else in the world. The poverty rates are 40, 50% on average. Whether the private sector is struggling, the financial intermediation is low, the human and welfare indicators are abysmal. You don't see any of this strong developmental record that you see in countries like Malaysia, and you can go to each of the countries of the Franc zone. Even though they are different, you have the oil economies like Gabon and, Cameroon used to be, I guess, and then you have some of the others in the Sahel. They all suffer the same developmental problem. Now, what is the problem with the CFA? Why is it an opaque and system that is not modern? So I found in my analysis that there's four macroeconomic problems with the CFA. First, it's an anomaly of history for any developing country to peg their currency to a strong currency. So Indians refuse to peg to the pound. The Chinese have been very careful. And so what happens is when you have a strong currency, you basically subsidize imports and you penalize exports. So the Franc zone becomes an importing country par excellence. So Gabon used to produce food, now they import food. Most of West Africa is importing food. So the overvalued currency is a disincentive to the private sector. That's one. Two, there's another anomaly in the Franc zone: exchange rate flexibility. Policymakers throughout the world use exchange rates to manage shocks. When you have a shock, you let the exchange rate adjust exports and imports. You stimulate your economies with exchange rate management, and the Franc zone is rigid. As an Argentinian macroeconomist said, being pegged to the euro in the Franc zone is trying to run a marathon with a refrigerator on your back. It doesn't give policy flexibility to monetary authorities and to fiscal authorities. It's a straitjacket arrangement. That's the second problem. The third is it's an elite arrangement, an urban elite who puts money in Europe and who benefits from cheap imports of champagne or of French or European consumer goods. It doesn't stimulate the tradable sectors. It doesn't stimulate SMEs. It's a political economy of bias against agriculture. What people don't know about China, Vietnam, Indonesia is that reform began with agriculture. They're all food self-sufficient countries. And then they moved to manufacturing. The Franc zone has skipped that. Fourth is financial repression. It's a system, and I think Professor Melvin can speak better on this topic than me. And Professor Akbar, it's a system of repression. Credit to GDP is the lowest in the world in the Franc zone. Because of this operations account, 50% of the money is put in France in the operations account. Not only that, there are very tight restrictions on money supply. So basically, all the money goes to defend the peg. So you have to keep a huge amount of reserves. What does that mean? You don't have money for much else. So you have this very tight limits on credit creation. So um, my bottom line in my book is it's an antiquated system defended by political elites, and unfortunately, it's supported by intellectual elites. This was the mystery to me when I researched the book. In Asia, you had a strong push of the intellectuals to be nationalists and to promote development. But the Francophone intellectual elite is not only kind of linked to France, but they also borrow their analysis from this kind of the Bretton Woods, the French Treasury perspective, which talks of macro stability. But as serious macroeconomists know, macro stability is just a word. What does it mean in reality for the people living in these regions? So I was frankly quite upset and surprised by that this system has persisted when there's no developmental of reason for it. Even countries like Russia, they decided to to float the currency. The move in the world is to float the currency. The European Central Bank is doing counter-cyclical monetary policy. You're playing with interest rates. What people don't understand about the franc zone is Togo and Gabon are not the same economic cycle of Germany. So, but the franc zone has to accept the policy of the European Central Bank. So if European Central Bank increases interest rate this year, franc zone has to do the same. So it's the problem of the peg. Now I come to my final point. So it's an anomaly, it's anti-developmental. What are the solutions? And I speak from a macroeconomic perspective. There's three kinds of solutions. The status quo is not working, and it will not be able to work by design. It cannot work. What are the three solutions? Number one is, and Professor Akpur has written very eloquently on this. One is what we call a kind of a basket peg. This is the Jeffrey Frankel Harvard macroeconomic perspective. I'm sympathetic to that view, in which he says you don't want to be, many of the CMAC countries are producing oil, so they should export. Oil should be part of the equation. When oil price goes down, the currency goes down. When oil price goes up, currency goes up. There's many advantages to that, but you give the central bankers a lot more flexibility. In monetary policy, when the currency goes down, they have no more money to invest in the economy in local currency terms. So that's the one option. The second option is you float your currency. And many countries are floating the currency. It's not it's used, but you need to have a proper framework if you float your currency, meaning you got to have certain rules. You can't just you can't replace one fire with another fire, and so what happens is you should have a kind of a monetary policy framework where you still target inflation, but not at 2%, at much higher level, like Ghana and South Africa do. You can develop your fiscal system. We can get into it in the Q&A. Many countries are now doing managed floats, and even Rwanda, Mauritius, and most of them are working well. So my third point is capital strike. One of the difficulties for the franc zone is if you exit the franc zone, there will be a lot of hostility because there's a lot of political interest, both outside and inside, in the persistence. Capital strike is a kind of a concept from Bowles and Gintis, two very prominent macroeconomists on the American left. And they say that the international system will penalize countries who exit from the franc zone by leading to capital outflows, by creating destabilizing currency movement. So the solution to the capital strike problem is for any kind of group who wants to exit the franc zone is to make swap lines. You make a swap line with the US Fed, you make a swap line with international, some Middle Eastern countries, and the advantage of a swap line, it gives your currency some credibility in the international market. Anyway, I've talked a lot, but my main point is that this system is not working. I think we all know that. And there's many possibilities of a new system. One has to advance the debate intellectually. We are seeing a lot of friction in the franc zone. CAR, Mali, um, um, uh, Senegal, we're starting to see some, Burkina Faso. So this is an obsolete system that is anti-developmental. It defies the kind of consensus of modern macroeconomics about exchange rate management. And I look forward to Q&A. Thank you so much.